Story 1. I thought I had finally escaped it all. The stress, the mistakes, and the people who wouldn't let me forget. But out here, in the quiet, lonely woods, I realized how wrong I was. It was the year 2020, and the world was shutting down. Everyone was stuck inside their homes, but I saw it as the perfect chance to escape. I've always loved camping and hiking, so I packed up my truck and set off for Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. The crisp winter air and the sound of snow crunching under my boots felt like a fresh start. Things had been tough for me after what happened at my job in 2019. A mistake I made ended up costing people a lot of money, and they weren't going to let me forget it. My phone buzzed with angry texts day and night, some of them even threatening. I tried everything, changing my number, moving to a new apartment, even quitting my job, but the fear always followed me. After a while, the messages stopped, and I hoped it was all finally over. This trip was supposed to be my escape, a way to clear my head and enjoy the peace of nature. I parked my truck and started the long hike to the creek, where I planned to set up camp. The woods were empty, probably because of the lockdown, and the silence felt comforting. I set up my tent, lit a fire, and finally let myself relax. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. As the fire crackled and I read my book by its glow, my phone suddenly vibrated. I pulled it out of my pocket, expecting a message from my family. But what I saw made my heart skip a beat. A message from an unknown number. It simply read, "How's your camping trip, buddy?" I stared at the screen, frozen. My mind raced. Who could it be? How did they know I was here? I looked around the dark forest, feeling the peace I had found slowly slip away. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a night I would never forget. I tried to brush off the message, telling myself it was probably just a wrong number. But deep down, something didn't feel right. I glanced around the woods, the darkness creeping in as the last traces of daylight faded. The gentle crackling of the fire was the only sound, but suddenly, the quiet didn't feel so peaceful anymore. I put my phone back in my pocket and focused on the warmth of the fire, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A few minutes passed and my phone buzzed again. Another message. This time it read, "It's beautiful out here." My stomach dropped. Whoever this was, they weren't just texting me, they were watching me. I jumped to my feet and shone my headlamp into the trees, scanning the area. Snow-covered branches swayed gently in the breeze, and the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. I couldn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself to stay calm. I had a gun in my backpack for safety, and I wasn't completely defenseless. But the thought of someone lurking nearby, silently watching me, sent shivers down my spine. I grabbed my phone again and quickly typed a response. "Who is this?" I waited, staring at the screen, hoping it was just a prank or some mistake. But the woods around me felt different now, heavier, like they were closing in. Minutes passed with no reply, so I tried to distract myself. I poked at the fire, letting the warmth soak in, and took a few bites of my food. But every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had me on edge. Eventually, I decided to retreat into my tent, hoping that shutting myself inside would make me feel safer. With my headlamp still on, I crawled into my sleeping bag and pulled out my book, forcing myself to focus on the words. Just when I started to feel a little better, my phone buzzed again. I hesitated before picking it up, my heart pounding in my chest. The message was short, but it was enough to send a wave of fear crashing over me. "I see why you came here." My mind raced. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had followed me. I turned off my headlamp and lay still, listening to the silence outside, every nerve in my body on high alert. I gripped my backpack, feeling the reassuring weight of my gun inside, but for the first time, I wasn't sure if it would be enough. I lay in the darkness of my tent, clutching my phone tightly, my pulse racing with every beat. My breathing felt too loud, and I tried to steady it, afraid that whoever was out there could hear me. I stared at the last message on my phone screen. I see why you came here. My mind spiraled with possibilities. Could it be someone I knew? Had someone followed me all the way out here? The worst part was I had no idea how long they had been watching me. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination running wild, but the uneasy silence outside told me otherwise. No distant crunch of animals moving through the snow, no rustling leaves, just an unsettling stillness as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I reached for my backpack and pulled out my handgun, holding it tightly as I sat up inside the tent. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint flickering shadows against the thin fabric walls of my shelter. Then it happened. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunches in the snow. My whole body tensed. I held my breath, listening as the steps grew closer, stopping just a few feet from my tent. I could almost feel the presence standing outside, watching, waiting. My hand trembled slightly as I turned off my phone screen, afraid the glow would give away my position inside. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, out of nowhere, a sudden flash of light illuminated the tent for a split second, like someone had taken a picture. My heart slammed against my chest. Before I could even process what was happening, my phone buzzed again. With shaky hands, I unlocked it and saw a new message. Have a good night's sleep. I couldn't take it anymore. My instincts screamed at me to act. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, but I saw nothing, just the empty, snow-covered ground under the moonlight. No footprints, no sign of anyone, but I knew they were out there, watching, waiting. I sat frozen for a moment, debating whether to run, stay inside, or confront whatever was lurking in the woods. My hand tightened around my gun. The cold air seeping into the tent felt suffocating. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just some prank. Someone was out here with me, and they weren't just passing through. I couldn't sit there any longer, trapped in my own fear. My grip tightened on the gun as I unzipped the tent just enough to stick my head out. The fire outside had almost died out, leaving only faint embers glowing in the snow. I scanned the darkness, my headlamp casting shaky beams of light across the trees. Nothing moved. The silence felt heavier than before, pressing down on me like a weight. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time they were moving, circling around me. Each step crunched the snow in a slow, deliberate rhythm. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. I aimed the gun blindly into the dark, whispering to myself, "Who's there?" But the only answer was the sound of the wind picking up, rustling through the branches. I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit and wait for whatever or whoever was out there to make their next move. Without thinking, I took a deep breath, unzipped the tent fully, and jumped outside. The cold hit me instantly, but I didn't care. I raised the gun and fired 2 shots into the air. The gunshots echoed through the forest, shattering the silence. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it. Rapid footsteps retreating through the snow, crunching faster and faster until they faded into the distance. I stood there, my breath clouding the air, listening. My fingers trembled around the gun, but I didn't lower it. I scanned the tree line, waiting, but whoever had been watching me was gone, for now. My phone buzzed again. Dreading what I would see, I unlocked it with shaky hands. Another message, short and chilling. That was loud. But I'll be back. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My throat felt dry and I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to run straight to my truck. I couldn't stay here any longer. I rushed back into the tent, shoved my things into my backpack, and threw snow over the dying fire, smothering it completely. Every second I spent packing felt like an eternity. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow lurking just beyond the trees. The feeling of being watched never left. I finally grabbed my gear and bolted down the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly with every step. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, my hands fumbling with the keys as I jumped inside and locked the doors. My chest heaved as I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring into the dark woods. The forest looked calm, undisturbed, but I knew better. I wasn't alone tonight, and whoever had been out there, they knew exactly where I was. Exactly. I sat in my truck for what felt like hours, my fingers still tightly wrapped around the steering wheel. My breath was shallow, and my heart thumped so hard I could feel it in my ears. I kept staring into the dense forest ahead, half expecting to see a shadow move between the trees, but nothing happened. The night was still, too still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I checked my phone again, hoping to see a message from someone, anyone. But the only thing on my screen was the last chilling text. That was loud, but I'll be back. The words felt like a threat, a promise that this wasn't over. My hands trembled as I turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life and breaking the silence around me. I didn't waste another second. With one last glance at the empty trail behind me, I pressed the gas and sped down the winding road, leaving the campsite and the terrifying memories behind. The drive home was a blur. Every turn in the road felt like a potential ambush, and every flicker of shadow on the side made my skin crawl. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following me, but the road stayed empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, gripping the gun still resting in my lap. The warmth of home should have been comforting, but instead it felt like I had brought something back with me, something unseen but still lingering in the corners of my mind. That night I barely slept. Every creak of my apartment, every distant noise outside made me sit up and reach for my gun. I kept replaying the events in my head, questioning everything. Who was out there? How did they know where I was? Was it someone from my past, or was it something worse? Days turned into weeks, and I waited for another text, another sign that they were still watching. But nothing came. Slowly, life moved on, and I tried convincing myself that it was just a twisted prank, that I was finally free. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whoever they weren't just some random stranger. They knew me. They followed me. And the worst part? They wanted me to know they were there. Even now, years later, I haven't gone camping again. The thought of being alone in the woods sends a chill down my spine. The memory of that night stays with me. Every text, every sound, every shadow in the trees. And no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that one day I might get another message. I see you. And next time, I might not be so lucky. Story 2. It happened 2 years ago, but I still can't stop thinking about it. That night in the woods changed everything for me. My dad and I had planned a simple camping trip, something we had done many times before. We loved being outdoors, hiking through the trails, and sitting around the campfire talking for hours. This time, we decided to go a little deeper into the country, somewhere more peaceful, away from the usual crowds. We found a nice spot, a campground surrounded by thick trees with a river nearby and miles of untouched land. It seemed perfect, at least at first. The first night was exactly what we hoped for. Families laughing at their campsites, the smell of campfires in the air, and the comforting hum of nature all around us. We roasted marshmallows, shared a few beers, and enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere. But the next day, things took a strange turn. As we were grabbing snacks from the park's information center, one of the staff members mentioned something that stuck with me. He casually said, "Looks like you two are the only ones left here tonight." At first, it sounded exciting, having the whole place to ourselves, but as the day went on, the excitement started to fade into something else. On our way back to the campsite, the forest felt different. The air felt heavier, colder, like something was watching us. My dad must have sensed it too, because he kept glancing over his shoulder, walking a little faster than usual. I tried to laugh it off, blaming it on the spooky podcast we listened to earlier by the river, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The silence felt unnatural. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our boots crunching on the trail. We made it back to the camp, but the uneasiness stayed with me. We sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the night, but every now and then I caught my dad staring out into the woods, his face tense. I told myself we were just being paranoid. After all, we were alone out here. Or, at least, that's what we thought. The sun dipped below the trees, and the darkness crept in faster than I expected. Sitting by the fire, I tried to focus on the crackling flames and the warmth they provided, but that unsettling feeling wouldn't leave me. My dad was unusually quiet, too, poking at the fire absent-mindedly. Every now and then, we'd hear a distant sound, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, but we told ourselves it was just the wind or some small animal moving through the woods. Still, the way the sounds seemed to come and go made my skin crawl. We decided to charge our phones at the information center before it got too dark, just to be safe. As we walked back, that strange feeling returned, stronger this time. The forest, which had felt peaceful the day before, now seemed endless, like it was stretching in every direction. My dad finally spoke up, his voice uneasy. "Doesn't this place feel off?" I nodded, not wanting to admit it, but I felt it too. Something was different tonight. Back at the campsite, we did our best to shake it off. We roasted more marshmallows, played some music on my phone, and even joked about the creepy atmosphere. But even laughter couldn't make the woods feel any less strange. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the trees around us, and with every passing minute the silence grew deeper, more oppressive. Then we heard it. A loud bang echoed through the trees, making us both freeze. It wasn't the sound of a branch falling or an animal moving. It was something heavier, deliberate. My dad immediately grabbed his flashlight and scanned the woods, but there was nothing, just the stillness of the trees standing like silent watchers. "Maybe it was just something falling," I said, trying to sound calm, but my dad's face told me he wasn't convinced. We sat there in tense silence, listening, waiting. Minutes passed, and just as we started to relax, the sound came again. This time, closer. My dad whispered, "We're not alone." I felt my stomach drop. My hands were shaking as I reached for my flashlight, pointing it into the darkness. The light barely touched the thick trees beyond our campsite, swallowed by the overwhelming blackness. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something was out there, and it was getting closer. We sat in complete silence, listening intently to the woods around us. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The fire crackled softly, but beyond that the forest had gone dead silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls. It was as if the entire place was holding its breath. My dad and I exchanged nervous glances, both too afraid to say what we were thinking. Then another bang, closer this time. It sounded like something heavy striking a tree, and it was no longer coming from the same spot. It was moving. Whatever it was circling us. My dad grabbed the flashlight again and swept it across the trees, his hand shaking slightly. The beam of light revealed nothing but an eerie wall of branches and shadows, but I could feel it. Something was out there, watching us. I whispered, "What do we do?" But my dad didn't answer right away. He was staring out into the woods, his face pale. Then he said quietly, "We stay put. Don't panic." But I could hear the fear in his voice, and that scared me even more. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but then came the worst sound yet. A low, deep humming. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something unnatural. The noise vibrated through my chest, like it was inside me. My dad muttered under his breath, "What the hell is that?" And I could tell he was trying to stay calm, but his grip on the flashlight was tightening. We both turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. Just beyond the dim glow of our dying fire, there was something standing there. It was tall, too tall to be human, and it wasn't moving. Just watching. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't look away. My dad saw it too, and I felt him grab my arm tightly. "Get in the tent," he whispered harshly. I wanted to run, to bolt to the car and get the hell out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stood there for a moment longer. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it seemed to fade back into the darkness. We scrambled into the tent, zipping it shut, even though deep down we both knew it wouldn't protect us from whatever was out there. Inside, the humming sound grew louder, almost like it was inside our heads. We sat there, huddled in the dark, clutching the only weapon we had, a small hunting knife. The seconds dragged on, the tent walls feeling thinner with every breath. Then, without warning, it all stopped. The humming, the footsteps, everything. We sat in complete silence, waiting, too scared to move. I didn't know what was worse, the sound or the sudden quiet that followed it. My dad whispered, "Don't look outside." But I already knew. Whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was just waiting. Time seemed to stretch inside the tent. My dad and I sat frozen, barely breathing, our ears straining for any sound outside. The thick silence pressed against us, making it impossible to think clearly. My mind raced with questions. What was out there? Was it watching us? Was it getting closer? Every tiny creak of the tent fabric felt deafening, and I could feel the weight of the darkness surrounding us. Then, without warning, the ground beneath us shook with another loud bang, this time so close it felt like it was right outside the tent. My dad's hand shot up to my mouth, silently telling me to stay quiet. I could feel my chest rising and falling rapidly, but I fought the urge to make any noise. And then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, heavy, deliberate. It wasn't human. It was deep and raspy, like something struggling to pull air into its lungs. My eyes darted toward the small mesh window near the top of the tent, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I was terrified of what I might see staring back at me. My dad gripped the knife tightly, his knuckles turning white. I could see the tension in his jaw, the fear in his eyes. Whatever was outside, it wasn't leaving. We sat there, helpless, waiting for it to make a move. Then came the worst part. The tent suddenly shifted. Something was pressing against it, running a hand or something along the thin fabric. My heart nearly stopped. I clamped my eyes shut, silently praying it would go away. But the pressure on the tent moved slowly, tracing along the side until it reached the zipper. I could see the faint outline of something large just beyond the fabric. My dad whispered, his voice barely audible, "Don't move. Don't breathe." We sat there, paralyzed, waiting for the tent to rip open at any second. But then it stopped. The presence lingered for a moment longer, and just as quickly as it came, it stepped away. We heard the crunch of footsteps retreating into the woods, fading into the night. Neither of us moved for what felt like forever. Then, as if waking from a nightmare, my dad grabbed my arm and whispered, "We're leaving. Now." I nodded, my entire body shaking. We unzipped the tent in slow, careful movements, terrified of making any noise. The campsite was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the wind whistling through the trees. Our fire had burned down to nothing but cold ash, and everything around us felt wrong. We packed up as fast as we could, tossing everything into our bags without care. My dad kept the knife in his hand the entire time, eyes scanning the trees around us. As we made our way to the car, I could feel it. Something watching us, just beyond the tree line. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I did, I might not be able to look away. We threw our gear into the trunk without bothering to pack it properly. My dad fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the doors. We both jumped inside, slammed them shut, and locked them. For a moment, we just sat there, breathing heavily, staring out into the blackness beyond the windshield. The headlights cut through the trees, but they revealed nothing. It was like the forest had swallowed whatever had been out there. My dad didn't waste another second. He started the engine, and we peeled out of the campsite, gravel crunching under the tires as we sped down the narrow dirt road. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and our shaky breathing. Every turn we made, I couldn't help but glance at the side mirror, expecting to see something following us. But there was nothing. After what felt like forever, we finally hit the main road. My dad sighed, gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles still white. "We're never coming back here," he muttered under his breath. I nodded, too exhausted and scared to say anything. I stared out the window, watching the dark trees rush past, still feeling like we weren't truly alone. When we got home, the silence of the house should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I felt like I had brought something back with me, a lingering presence that refused to fade. I kept replaying the night in my head, the loud bangs, the breathing, the tent shifting under the weight of something unseen. None of it made sense. We never found footprints. We never heard anything after that night. But the fear remained. For weeks I couldn't sleep without the lights on. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear that slow, heavy breathing in my mind. My dad never talked about it. Anytime I tried to bring it up, he'd shake his head and change the subject. It was like he was trying to forget, to pretend it never happened. But I knew he felt it too. Some things can't be explained, and some things aren't meant to be. To this day, I don't know what was out there. I don't know if it was human, animal, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. It was real. And it was watching us. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. Story 3. Some places should be left alone, and I learned that the hard way. It happened years ago during our family's annual camping trip to my uncle's property deep in the woods. Every October, we'd all pack up and head to his old cabin in northern Michigan. The place was huge, with 5 bedrooms, a massive yard, and acres of thick forest stretching out in every direction. It was the perfect getaway for our whole family. At least, that's what we thought. My uncle had always warned us about going too far into the woods, saying there were wild animals and dangerous terrain. But as kids, we didn't care. We wanted adventure, and the deeper we went, the better it felt. That year, my cousins and I decided to do something we had never done before: camp overnight in the woods, away from the cabin. We set up our tent just past the red markings my uncle had painted on the trees, the ones he told us not to cross. We figured he was just being overprotective. At first, it was exciting. The thought of being out there alone, away from the adults, made us feel brave. We built a small fire, shared ghost stories, and laughed about how scared our younger cousin was. Everything felt normal. But looking back, I remember how the woods felt different that night. Darker, quieter, like the trees were watching us. We ignored it, pretending we weren't afraid. We had no idea what was waiting for us once the sun went down. Some places should be left alone, and I learned that the hard way. It happened years ago during our family's annual camping trip to my uncle's property deep in the woods. Every October, we'd all pack up and head to his old cabin in northern Michigan. The place was huge, with 5 bedrooms, a massive yard, and acres of thick forest stretching out in every direction. It was the perfect getaway for our whole family. At least, that's what we thought. My uncle had always warned us about going too far into the woods, saying there were wild animals and dangerous terrain. But as kids, we didn't care. We wanted adventure, and the deeper we went, the better it felt. That year, my cousins and I decided to do something we had never done before: camp overnight in the woods, away from the cabin. We set up our tent just past the red markings my uncle had painted on the trees, the ones he told us not to cross. We figured he was just being overprotective. At first, it was exciting. The thought of being out there alone, away from the adults, made us feel brave. We built a small fire, shared ghost stories, and laughed about how scared our younger cousin was. Everything felt normal. But looking back, I remember how the woods felt different that night. Darker, quieter, like the trees were watching us. We ignored it, pretending we weren't afraid. We had no idea what was waiting for us once the sun went down. We sat in the tent, completely frozen. No one spoke. The second scream had been too close, too real. My heart pounded in my chest as I held my breath, listening for anything, footsteps, rustling, anything at all. But there was only silence, thick and heavy, wrapping around us like a blanket. I could feel Joey trembling beside me, his breathing ragged and fast. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were scared. Jake, always trying to act tough, grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the tent's entrance. "It's probably just an animal," he whispered, but his hand was shaking. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew better. No animal screams like that. Then we heard it. Slow, crunching footsteps. They were coming from the trees, moving steadily toward us. Each step sent a chill through my body. Someone, or something, was out there, walking through the darkness. My throat felt dry, and I could barely swallow. The footsteps stopped just outside our tent. We all held our breath. The thin fabric separating us from whatever was outside felt useless. I gripped the sleeping bag tightly, feeling trapped. Then the tent shuddered. It was slight, but enough to make Joey whimper and Jake drop the flashlight in his lap. Something had brushed against it. A long, eerie silence followed. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I reached for my phone again, praying for a signal, but the screen showed nothing, just darkness. My fingers trembled as I set it down, feeling hopeless. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the tent, a faint outline cast by the dying fire outside. It was tall, too tall. It lingered for a moment before slipping away into the night. None of us dared to move. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. Jake whispered, "We need to get out of here." But how? Running meant stepping into the very darkness where that thing was waiting. Then, without warning, the tent shook violently. Like something was trying to get in. We all screamed, scrambling backward, pushing ourselves against the farthest corner of the tent. Joey started crying, and I felt my stomach twist with fear. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it had started, and then a sound that made my blood run cold. Whispering. It was soft, almost like a voice, but I couldn't understand the words. It circled the tent, moving slowly, just beyond the fabric. We sat in terrified silence, hoping, praying, that whatever was out there would go away. But deep down I knew it wasn't leaving, not until it got what it wanted. The whispers grew louder, circling the tent like they were searching for a way in. They weren't normal whispers. They were distorted, like voices coming from underwater, low and drawn out. My body was frozen, every muscle tense, but my mind was screaming at me to run. The fire outside had almost burned out, and without its glow, the tent felt even smaller, swallowed by the darkness pressing in from all sides. Jake grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to move," he mouthed, barely making a sound. But I didn't know where to go. Stepping outside meant facing whatever was out there. Staying inside felt just as dangerous. Joey was sobbing quietly, trying to stifle the sounds with his hands, and I could feel his panic pushing me closer to the edge. Then something scratched against the tent fabric, slow, deliberate. It dragged from one side to the other, like it was feeling its way around. I clenched my jaw to keep from screaming. Jake scrambled to grab his flashlight, flicking it on, but the beam barely cut through the fabric. The scratching stopped. For a moment I thought maybe we scared it off, but then the entire tent collapsed inward, the weight of something pressing against it from all sides. We screamed, scrambling to push it back, but the pressure only grew stronger. The whispers turned into low, rasping breaths right outside. I felt something cold brush against my arm through the fabric, and I lost it. "Run!" I shouted, unzipping the tent with shaky hands and shoving Joey out first. We all tumbled into the freezing night, our flashlights swinging wildly as we bolted through the trees. My lungs burned, my legs aching as we ran, the sound of heavy footsteps crashing behind us. I didn't dare look back. I knew it was close. Branches whipped against my face, but I pushed forward, following the dim glow of the cabin's lights in the distance. Jake was right behind me, pulling Joey along, both of them panting hard. I could hear something behind us. Something fast, something big. It moved through the trees without effort, getting closer with every second. Finally, we reached the clearing. I nearly collapsed onto the porch, banging on the cabin door with everything I had. "Open up! Open up!" I screamed, my voice cracking with panic. The door flew open, and my uncle grabbed us, pulling us inside just as the noise outside suddenly stopped. We slammed the door shut, locking it tight. My dad and uncle stared at us, their faces pale. "What happened?" they asked, but none of us could speak. We just stood there, gasping for air, staring at the dark forest through the window. There was nothing out there now. No movement, no sound. But I knew it was still watching, waiting. We stood there in the cabin, trembling, staring out into the blackness beyond the trees. My uncle locked the door behind us, double-checking it twice, his face more serious than I had ever seen before. My dad poured us all a glass of water, but my hands were shaking too much to hold it. Joey sat on the couch, curled up with his knees to his chest, tears still running down his face. None of us said a word. We didn't need to. After a long silence, my uncle finally spoke. His voice was low, almost like he didn't want to be heard by whatever was out there. "I told you kids not to go past those trees." His eyes were fixed on the window, watching the woods as if expecting something to come back. We didn't argue. We didn't tell him he was overreacting. We knew he wasn't. Whatever had been outside that tent wasn't something we could explain, and deep down, I think my uncle knew more than he was letting on. My dad tried to lighten the mood, saying it was probably just an animal, maybe a bear, but his voice lacked conviction. He didn't believe it, and neither did we. That night, none of us slept. Every creak of the old cabin made me jump. I could still hear the whispers in my head, that strange, distorted voice circling us in the tent. I kept picturing the dark figure I had seen moving past the tent, standing just outside, waiting. The next morning, we packed up and left. No one argued. No one said goodbye to the woods. We just got in the car and drove away, leaving that place behind us. My uncle never invited us back after that, and we never asked. Years have passed since that night, but I still remember every detail, the whispers, the footsteps, the feeling of being trapped inside that tent. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed late at night, I swear I can still hear it. Soft, distant, just outside my window. I don't go camping anymore, and I never will again. Some places aren't meant to be explored, and some things should be left in the dark where they belong.